The night was still and eerily quiet, the kind of silence that made the world feel heavier. Federal Judge Omer Jackson's sleek Tesla glided smoothly down the tree-lined streets of his affluent suburban neighborhood. The car's electric hum was barely audible, blending seamlessly with the soft rustle of leaves in the evening breeze. It was late, too late, really. Omer had promised his wife, Leah, that he'd be home in time for dinner, but the day had spiraled out of control as it often did. Court hearings, case reviews, and endless paperwork had consumed his hours. His mind wandered as he navigated the familiar streets. He thought of Leah, probably frustrated again at his late return, and their son Malik, whose basketball game he had missed for the third time that month. Malik was 14 now, straddling the line between boyhood and young adulthood, and Omer could feel the distance growing between them. Guilt gnawed at him, but it was a familiar companion, one he had learned to live with over the years. Then came the lights. Red and blue strobes filled his rearview mirror, their piercing brilliance cutting through the darkness like a knife. For a brief moment, Omer thought he must have imagined it. His heart quickened, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. But the unmistakable wail of a siren followed, shattering any hope that this was a mistake. Omer glanced at the dashboard. Speed limit? Check. Signal lights? Check. Registration up to date? Check. He had done nothing wrong, nothing. And yet, a sinking feeling of dread settled in his chest, a feeling that no amount of success or accolades could erase. He knew this drill. Every black man in America did. He signaled and pulled over to the curb, his movements deliberate and slow. He turned off the music, rolled down his window, and kept his hands firmly on the steering wheel, making sure they were visible. After decades of navigating life as a black man, Omer had learned to anticipate these moments, to approach them with the careful choreography of someone who knew that one misstep could change everything. The police cruiser stopped behind him, its lights still flashing. Omer watched in the side mirror as the officer stepped out, a tall woman with a flashlight, her face unreadable under the harsh glow of the strobe. She approached his car slowly, the beam of her flashlight sweeping over the back seat, the license plate, the interior of the vehicle, and finally his face. "License and registration," she said, her tone flat and devoid of emotion. The name tag on her uniform read, "Clark." Omer nodded, his movements precise as he reached for his wallet, and then the glove compartment. "What seems to be the problem, officer?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. "We received a report of a suspicious vehicle in the area," she replied curtly, her eyes flicking over his tailored suit and the clean lines of the Tesla. Omer frowned. "This is my neighborhood," he said evenly. "I live just up the street." Clark didn't respond immediately. Instead, she clicked her radio. "Unit 45, requesting backup," she said, her voice crackling through the speaker. "Backup? For what?" A surge of frustration and anger coursed through Omer, but he suppressed it, forcing himself to remain composed. He wanted to protest, to assert his rights, but he knew better. No matter how many degrees or titles he earned, moments like this always reminded him of the cold, unspoken truth. To someone like Clark, he was just another black man in a nice car, in a neighborhood where he apparently didn't belong. "Step out of the vehicle," Clark ordered. Omer's stomach tightened. He glanced up at her, his jaw clenching. He wanted to argue, to demand an explanation, but the weight of years of warnings and lived experiences silenced him. Slowly, he unbuckled his seatbelt and stepped out into the cool night air, his hands raised slightly to show he meant no harm. The situation escalated further when a second cruiser pulled up, and Captain Marcus Roberts, a seasoned officer with a weathered face, stepped out. Roberts immediately recognized Omer, his expression shifting from suspicion to embarrassment. "Judge Jackson?" Roberts said, his voice tinged with disbelief. Omer met his gaze, his face impassive. "Yes, Captain. That's me." Roberts turned to Clark, his tone now sharp. "Stand down, Officer Clark. There's been a mistake." But it wasn't a mistake. It was a symptom of a deeper, more insidious problem, one that Omer could no longer ignore. Chapter 2: Fractured Trust. The next morning, the golden rays of sunlight filtering through the blinds did little to lift the weight in Omer's chest. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying the previous night's events. The flashing lights, the curt demands, the simmering humiliation, it all lingered like a bitter taste. He had done everything right, lived his life by the rules, and yet here he was again. The smell of coffee drifted into the room, pulling him out of his thoughts. Downstairs, Leah was making breakfast, the familiar clatter of pans and the soft laughter of their children filling the house. It was a scene he had worked so hard to create: stability, safety, a refuge from the world outside. But last night had shattered the illusion. Omer descended the stairs, his movements heavy with exhaustion. Leah was at the stove, flipping pancakes, while Malik and Alana, their 10-year-old daughter, sat at the table arguing over syrup. "Morning," Leah said, glancing over her shoulder with a warm smile that quickly faded when she saw his face. "What's wrong?" He poured himself a cup of coffee, avoiding her gaze. "Got pulled over last night," he said quietly. Leah froze, the spatula hovering midair. Leah's expression hardened, her jaw tightening as she set the spatula down. "Suspicious? In your own neighborhood? This is getting ridiculous, Omer." He sighed, sinking into a chair at the table. "Captain Roberts showed up. Recognized me. Told them to let me go. And that's supposed to make it better?" Leah's voice rose, her frustration evident. "They stopped you for no reason. Again." Malik looked up from his plate, his brows furrowing. "Dad, what happened?" Omer hesitated, glancing at his son. Malik was old enough to understand, but Omer hated having these conversations. He wanted to shield his children from the harsh realities of the world, but he also knew he couldn't protect them forever. "Just a misunderstanding," Omer said, forcing a smile. "Nothing to worry about." But Malik wasn't convinced. He had inherited his father's sharp mind, and Omer could see the questions forming behind his eyes. Questions he wasn't ready to answer. Leah sat down across from him, her gaze piercing. "This keeps happening, Omer. You're a federal judge, and they still treat you like this. What are we teaching our kids if we just let it slide?" Omer ran a hand over his face, the weight of her words pressing down on him. She was right. This wasn't the first time, and it wouldn't be the last. He had spent years trying to rise above it, to believe that his success would insulate him from the prejudice that had shaped his youth. But last night had been a harsh reminder that no title, no degree, no amount of respect could erase the color of his skin in the eyes of the world. "I don't know what you want me to do, Leah," he said finally. "File a complaint? Sue the department? I have a family to think about." Leah's expression softened, but her determination didn't waver. "I want you to fight back. Not just for us, but for everyone who doesn't have your platform. If you don't, who will?" Her words hung in the air, heavy with truth. Omer looked at Malik, who was now silently watching him, his young face filled with a mixture of curiosity and unease. He thought about the world his son would grow up in, the lessons he would learn, the battles he would face. Omer had spent his life fighting for justice in the courtroom, but maybe it was time to fight for it outside as well. "All right," he said, his voice firm. "I'll do something." Chapter 3: Beneath the Surface expanded. Omer spent the next few days consumed by the need to understand what had happened. He immersed himself in research, combing through public databases, legal precedents, and police records. He set up a war room in his home office, pinning articles and printed complaints on the corkboard he normally used for case summaries. Late one evening, Malik wandered into the room. His sneakers squeaked on the hardwood floor, and Omer looked up, startled. "What are you doing up?" "It's late. I couldn't sleep," Malik said, his voice soft. He hesitated near the door, his eyes drifting over the papers strewn across the desk. "Is this about what happened the other night?" Omer froze, unsure how to respond. Malik had been quiet since the traffic stop, but Omer could tell it had left a mark. At 14, Malik was at an age where the world's harsh realities were beginning to intrude on his innocence. "Yeah," Omer admitted finally. "I'm trying to figure out why." Malik stepped closer, his gaze fixed on the corkboard. "Do they stop everyone like that?" Omer sighed. "No, son. Not everyone. Just people who look like me. And you." The words hung heavy in the air. Malik's face fell, and he shuffled his feet awkwardly. "What can we do about it?" Omer's heart ached at the question. He wanted to tell his son that everything would be fine, that the world would get better. But he couldn't lie. Instead, he pulled Malik into a chair beside him. "We fight," Omer said firmly. "Not with fists or anger, but with the truth. We stand up, even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard." Chapter 4. Leah's Perspective. While Omer buried himself in research, Leah wrestled with her own frustration. She had always admired her husband's sense of justice, but now it felt like a double-edged sword. Every late-night phone call, every shadow lingering outside their house, reminded her of the danger they were in. One evening, Leah sat on the porch with her sister, Rachel, who had come to visit after hearing about the incident. "Have you told Mom?" Rachel asked, sipping a glass of iced tea. Leah shook her head. "What's the point? She'll just worry. She already thinks Omer's career puts us at risk. Doesn't it?" Rachel pressed. "Look, I love him, but this isn't just about you anymore. You've got Malik and Alana to think about." Leah's grip tightened on her glass. "You think I don't know that? But what am I supposed to do? Tell him to stop? Tell him to look the other way while our son grows up thinking this is normal?" Rachel reached for Leah's hand. "I'm just saying, be careful. He's not just fighting for himself anymore." Leah nodded, though her resolve remained unshaken. She knew Omer wouldn't stop, and deep down, she didn't want him to. But the fear lingered, a constant shadow over their lives. Chapter 5. A City's History. As Omer's research deepened, he uncovered a history of systemic abuse that stretched back decades. His city, like many others, had been shaped by redlining policies that segregated neighborhoods and restricted access to wealth for people of color. Gentrification was just the latest chapter in a long story of exploitation. Omer compiled maps, historical records, and testimonies from residents displaced by Garrison's developments. He spoke with community leaders who had fought losing battles to protect their neighborhoods, their voices tinged with exhaustion and anger. One conversation stuck with him. An elderly woman named Mrs. Rosario, who had lived in her home for over 40 years, described how the harassment began. "They came every week," she said, her voice trembling. "First, it was code violations, grass too long, fence too short. Then, the cops started showing up. My son was arrested twice for loitering. Loitering! In front of his own house." Omer's hands tightened into fists as he listened. Mrs. Rosario's story was one of dozens, each more heartbreaking than the last. Chapter 6. David Silva's Journey. David Silva hadn't planned on becoming a whistleblower. When he joined the police force, he had hoped to make a difference, to be one of the good guys. But it didn't take long to see the rot beneath the surface. Silva's breaking point came when he was ordered to arrest a young black man for trespassing in an apartment building. The man, dressed in a security uniform, had protested, showing his work badge and keys. But the sergeant had insisted, muttering, "We've got orders." Later, Silva learned the building was slated for demolition, and Garrison had been pressuring tenants to leave. The man's arrest was just one more tactic to empty the property. That night, Silva sat in his car outside the station, staring at his badge. He thought about his own family, about how his parents had struggled to keep their home in the face of rising rents and harassment. He couldn't stay silent anymore. Chapter 7. The threats escalate. As Omer and Daryl built their case, the threats became impossible to ignore. One night, Leah found a brick thrown through the living room window. The note tied to it read, "Drop it, or else." Omer called Daryl immediately. "They're trying to scare us," he said, his voice steady but grim. "They're scared because they know we're getting close," Daryl replied. "But we need to be careful. They'll get desperate." Omer hired a private security firm to watch the house, but the sense of unease lingered. Malik started having nightmares, and Alana asked why there were men in suits outside her school. Chapter 8. The courtroom expanded. The trial stretched on for weeks, each day more grueling than the last. The defense pulled every trick in the book, trying to discredit Silva and dismiss the evidence as circumstantial. But Daryl's cross-examinations were surgical, dismantling their arguments piece by piece. On the final day, Omer delivered his closing statement. "This isn't just about one officer, one developer, or one city," he said, his voice resonating through the courtroom. "It's about a system that prioritizes profit over people, that treats justice as a commodity. But today, we have a chance to change that. To say enough." The room erupted into applause as Omer returned to his seat, his hands trembling slightly. Chapter 9. Legacy and Hope. The verdict was a landslide victory. Garrison was convicted of fraud, and several officers faced federal charges. The city announced sweeping reforms, including civilian oversight of the police department. For Omer, the victory was bittersweet. He knew the fight wasn't over. Rebuilding trust and dismantling systemic racism would take years. But as he watched Malik and Alana play in the yard, their laughter ringing through the air, he felt a glimmer of hope.